But for now, it's time to come back to my side of the pond for the work of Mind's Eye Productions, aka the ones that came in those wooden crates. Yes, 11 years after the BBC Hobbit radio adaptation, an American group tackled both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings for broadcast on NPR. I have not been able to find the exact broadcast dates for these shows. I don't even know for a fact which order they played in, but I will cover The Hobbit first because that's the story that comes first, whether or not the broadcast did.
In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
Okay, Oliphant in the room. This thing is fighting an uphill battle with me when I already think The Hobbit was adapted to radio almost perfectly. So I'm going to start with some positive notes about this version. It is nice that this adaptation includes parts that the BBC radio version glossed over. Sure, it still doesn't include Chip the Glasses Crack the Plates or the Trolls Talking Purse, but it actually dramatizes the dwarves showing up 2 by 2 to Beorn's lodgings, and it dramatizes Bombur falling into the Enchanted River instead of just breezing through them both in narration the way the BBC show did.
Careful, Bombur, or you'll swamp the boat.
I won't!
Bombur's fallen in! He'll drown!
Throw him the rope.
And this version does include Bilbo coming home to find an auction at Bag End, but that pretty much is covered in narration.
He had arrived back in the middle of an auction in which the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins Esquire of Bag End, Underhill, Hobbiton, were being disposed of by Bilbo's cousins, the Sackville Bagginses.
But since the 68 version omitted that entirely, it's nice to hear that particular comic beat addressed. By my math, we should have gotten another radio version in 1990 that acted out the auction, but only described Chip the Glasses. But if we did get one, its memory is lost to the ages. But other than those handful of omissions that either one or both made, both of these adaptations are pretty faithful, so the biggest differences come in delivery.
Where are you going?
What about a little light?
We like the dark.
Dark for dark business.
See, that's almost as iconic as it is in the BBC version.
We like the dark. Dark for dark business.
Ray Reinhardt is Bilbo, and
Just what I say. And please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean.
he's fine. Bilbo is fine in this. It's not his fault that Paul Damon's Bilbo in the earlier radio show was exquisite.
Please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a very good cook myself, you know. And I cook better than I cook. if you see what I mean.
Tom Luce is Thorin, and
We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, may never return.
he kind of sounds like Orson Welles trying to do John Wayne mixed with Jimmy Stewart, but accidentally dipping into Paul Lynde. But he's fine.
Now what? Somebody's banging with a stick.
Carefully, carefully. It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a pop gun.
That was the sound of the door opening like a pop gun? Those are some gently tumbling dwarves. Then again, we don't know what pop guns in Middle-earth are like, since we don't know what guns in Middle-earth are like. Ha. I've said there's never been a bad version of Misty Mountain's Cold, and I'm not quite ready to label this version bad, but this is probably my least favorite I've heard.
The dwarves of yore make mighty spells.
I give them credit for doing more of the verses than the BBC did, even if they still don't cover all of them, and they change a word inexplicably.
Deep where dropping sleep in hollow halls beneath the hills. For ancient king and elfish lord.
And screeching to a complete halt between each stanza seems unnecessary.
And horde, they chased and wrought, and like they
Okay, what I'm about to say is probably completely inaccessible to everyone who didn't grow up Episcopalian, but this feels like when the season changes and suddenly all the hymns are to a different tune. The lyrics are still familiar, but the music feels off.
Dragonfire in twisted wire, they mix the light of moon and sun.
Okay, so let's compare the finding of the ring in both these radio versions. Here's the 68 BBC version.
Still, I guessed as well as I could, and I crawled along for a good way, until suddenly my hand met, on the floor of the tunnel, what felt like a little tiny ring of cold metal.
It was a turning point in the Hobbit's career. Not that he knew it at the time. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking.
And here's the 79 NPR version.
He crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it.
Feels like a ring. I'll just put it in my pocket.
It's like there's nothing wrong with it. It gets the point across. It just isn't infused with the same level of emotion. It's like a solid A-. The biggest thing this production gets right that my beloved BBC production gets wrong, the pronunciation of Gollum.
A slimy creature called Gollum watched him from a tiny rock island in the middle of the lake.
They get some other pronunciations wrong, but I'm trying to focus on the positive here. And it's hard to tell from the performance, but it sounds like this is yet another adaptation that has Bilbo deliberately ask a non-riddle.
What have I got in my pocket?
Are there more adaptations that get this wrong than get it right? It's weird. They also skip the pity that stays Bilbo's hand, but at least they paint a more accurate picture of his nerves in escaping than the smug taunting of Rankin Bass or Soviet Hobbit.
Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He trembled. And then, quite suddenly, in a flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped straight over Gollum's head. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hand snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the tunnel.
I will say, I still like this better than any of the filmed adaptations of The Hobbit. Any of the finished ones, anyway, that didn't just film actors reciting. If I had heard this before I heard the BBC one, I would have had very few criticisms, even though I think I still would have liked that version better once I heard it. I know it's not fair to judge a piece of media based on what it's not, rather than what it is, and this is good. It just was already done even better, and I heard the better version first. There's a lot of moments I liked in this one, but even then, more often than not, the most positive thought I had was, this scene is almost as good here as it is in the really good one. And the problem is, this adaptation isn't different enough from the earlier adaptation for me to enjoy it distinctly on its own without comparison. If this had a real unique take on any of the scenes or characters, I could potentially appreciate both as distinct versions, the way I can appreciate things from the numerous filmed adaptations of Tolkien. But unfortunately, this is trying the same basic thing as the earlier adaptation, and at its best, it's almost as good. Now, all that said, it actually is really nice to hear a version of The Hobbit adapted by the same team that adapted Lord of the Rings that still keeps the proper tone for The Hobbit.